Welcome, folks, to this week's edition of Tech Sales Advice. I am, of course, your host, Chris White. This is the LinkedIn live show for pre-sales professionals and pre-sales leaders. And I will emphasize, this is live. We are not coming to you from a recorded session. And as I like to say, by design, these conversations are unscripted, unrehearsed, and unpredictable. And I am absolutely delighted to welcome this week's guest, actually a return visitor. He is absolutely no stranger to this community and frankly, just the pre-sales industry, Mr. Greg Holmes. Greg is the area vice president of pre-sales in EMEA for Apptio. He's also an ambassador of the pre-sales collective. Greg, my friend, how are you, sir?
Hey there, Chris. Glad to be back. We'll redo this bit, right? Just to make sure we get it correct and without any hitch.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, it is really good to see you. And, you and I had a chance to catch up just for what, 3 minutes before we chatted or before we started here. And honestly, there are so many things that I want to ask you about. And I know we're going to talk about being a pre-sales professional in Europe and internationally. We're going to talk a little bit about onboarding and some of the challenges, particularly in this day and age. But before we get there, I just want to catch up for a minute. First of all, please more formally introduce yourself to this audience. In the unlikely event there's anybody who's listening or catches the recording who doesn't actually know who you are.
I would be, surprised if people all knew who I was, Chris. I feel like I connect out to people. I do like networking. I feel that networking in our industry is really valuable. It's really important to learn what your peers are doing. How are they solving similar challenges? So my name's Greg Holmes. I'm an area vice president of pre-sales for Apptio, responsible for Europe as my area. And I've got a team of pre-sales professionals around Europe. So we cover everywhere from France, Italy, Spain. Now that I've started, I've got to go through the whole list. So Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy. If I've said them already, that's okay. And we're covering the Middle East as well. Maybe in the future, North Africa, India. We'll get bigger and bigger as time goes on. But yeah, a really excellent team, very focused on Apptio's different product solutions and markets that we address. And in my spare time, I do a little bit of representation of the pre-sales community of the pre-sales collective as an ambassador. Last year, I helped them found the pre-sales leadership collective, which was a great way to start connecting and working with other pre-sales leaders and learning what they do. And in my other spare time, I write a little blog called thesalesengineerguy.com. And I put some of my appearances, experiences, and things like that, in that site so that you can look them up and let me know what you think.
That's fair. And now, am I correct? Are you still doing there's a Friday afternoon? Well, it's Friday. It's probably Friday early evening for you on that new social media. And I'm drawing a blank as to what it is.
It's the Clubhouse thing. Yeah.
Clubhouse. That's it.
Unlike everyone else who's given up on Clubhouse, we're still on it. We're still getting a vibrant kind of community around pre-sales topics. We just call it Pre-Sales Talks. It's a Clubhouse club called Pre-Sales Collective, so it reflects that community.
Excellent.
And every week we just do a different topic. Last week I was on a panel for Pre-Sales Collective called about imposter syndrome. So we talked more about imposter syndrome and how it affects people on the Pre-Sales Talks call on Clubhouse. So it's 12 Central, 6 p.m. GMT, adjusted for daylight time. And we do that every week. There's always a group who's interested in talking pre-sales. And if you just want a casual chat about pre-sales with a small group, that's a great opportunity to get on, ask some of your questions, and add some thoughts to the community.
Excellent. Well, and I actually have it on my calendar, and for some reason I always seem to get blocked, but I am going to make that one of these days. So incidentally, folks, if any of you have joined us live, of course, we welcome you to say hello. We cannot see you, so if you want to say hello, please do so. If you have any questions for Greg or myself, please ask. So Greg, we're going to talk a little bit about working internationally. Before we get there, you were mentioning that you're bringing your whole team together for the first time in a couple years. And so, I was eager to ask, are you and your team members, are you traveling to customers? Are you back in an office yet? How are things starting to, sort of unfold as we come out of this pandemic for your team?
Yeah, so I'm getting to my closest office 2-3 times a week at the moment, so it's stepping up for sure. Certainly seeing some customers face to face. Had a big event in London for one of our domain areas, FinOps, and so met the founders of that organization and others who are interested in that topic. Meeting up in London. So that was a 100-person event live with virtual attendees as well.
Yeah.
We're running a user conference this week with probably a similar kind of size of local attendees, and then extending out to hundreds of remote attendees.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of these virtual events that are bigger than just the event happening now, and that obviously requires a lot of technology. And I'm sure the pre-sales teams involved in selling those technologies are doing a good job now. But also, we're doing some customer visits. So we're certainly meeting up with some customers face to face, live in small groups.
Yeah.
And looking to meet them outside of the office as well. So lunches, dinners, remote events, those things are pretty exciting.
Yeah. Have you found that you or any of your folks have had to sort of relearn anything that we've kind of forgotten over the past couple of years?
I think you need to relearn what it's like in an actual office meeting, right? That you need to book the meeting room. You need to go and take people and get coffee first, then take them with their coffees to the meeting room and have, good casual conversation on the way.
Yeah.
It gives you a whole extra way to connect.
Yeah.
But when there's virtual attendees and local attendees, then you're becoming, a bit of a circus performer. You're juggling these attendees and making sure that they all are feeling looked after at the same time.
Yeah.
So then it can be a little bit more intense, and you need to be good on your organizational skills and making people welcome.
Circus performer. I love the mental image you just gave. By the way, I mean, in this role, we've almost always been performers to a certain degree, but I love that.
Yeah.
I'm curious to ask one more thing. When the pandemic started, I think there were a lot of us who talked about the things that we missed about being in the room together.
Mm-hmm.
Now that you find yourself back in the room with people, are you finding yourself thinking, gee, there's things about being in the Zoom behind the camera that I'm missing?
Indeed. I feel like in a Zoom environment, you can control a lot of things, right? You can control your background. What do people see behind you in a meeting? You control the whole experience. How much of your screen can they see? How are you, running multiple apps at the same time? How are you recording things? So there's a lot of control you get from being remote.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is when I know I've got a face-to-face meeting, whether it's in my office or the customer's office or somewhere else, I have to look at my schedule and I have to think, what is there currently in my schedule that is not going to help me do the main focus of that day, right? You've got to focus on what is your primary mission for that day or that hour or that segment, right?
Yeah.
And remove distractions, but also add things in that might be more useful then, right? So if I know I'm going to my office, I'll try to do all my one-to-ones with people who are going to be in that office.
Yeah.
I might even try and arrange some additional meetings with people that I rarely catch up with on remote meetings, but I would love to see them face to face and maybe get a coffee or lunch or whatever. But you've got to maximize the value of where you are.
Incredibly well said. It's interesting. I did my first in-person workshop in 2 years in January, almost 2 years. And I have to admit, and I had a room of about 35 people. This was a reasonably large group.
That's a big room.
Yeah, it's a big. It was by the way, it was a big, beautiful facility. I have to admit, when I first looked out to the group and all eyes were staring at me, it took me a minute or two to find my stride, right? Because we do this all the time, right? I mean, I got to the point where I was so used to standing in front of a group of people, I didn't even think twice about it. but I'm the first to admit that, even for someone who's been doing this a long, long time, to be staring in front of staring out at a group in, live, it took a minute to sort of restart some of those natural instincts. So anyway, I think it's going to be interesting. It's so funny. When the pandemic happened, a lot of us were talking about how are we handling the pandemic and doing everything through Zoom. I think for the next 6 months or so, I think a lot of us are going to be talking about the experience coming back into sort of the in-person world.
Yeah, I don't think those remote meetings are going to go away either. I think you're going to find that a lot of companies would much rather you don't always do face-to-face meetings, and that it might take certain good Zoom meetings first before you earn the right to ask for a face-to-face meeting.
Incredibly,
and then you need to switch gears and make the face-to-face meeting work the way you want it to work. So you can't just operate in one mode from now on.
And like you said, that hybrid environment where and I've done this a time. In fact, that session that I mentioned was hybrid, where now you're talking to both the people in the room and the people in the Zoom, so to speak. So anyway, that I was curious to get your perspective. And look, let's be honest. I think we're all happy that the world is starting to open back up again. So this is a very good thing. Let's shift our attention a little bit. Incidentally, for anybody who has joined us, I'm speaking with Greg Holmes. Greg is the Area Vice President of Presales for Apptio in Europe. And that's specifically or directly the topic we're going to touch on next. And Greg, I was mentioning to you that, I worked for European-based companies for over a decade. And yet if somebody had asked me, well, gee, Chris, what are some of the unique challenges or differences of being in pre-sales in Europe? There's a few things that come to mind, but I don't feel like I'm even an expert in that topic. So how would you first respond to that? What are some of the things that are unique about being in pre-sales in Europe?
So let's put it in the perspective that I'm talking from a situation where you're part of a branch organization, right? So suppose your main organization is in the US, like mine is, or it could be somewhere else around the world. So I'm sure many US people feel the same thing if they're not part of the core organization, if you like, or the main home base of the organization. You have a gap to your engineering, to a lot of the core functions, and you need to make up for that, right? So part of your challenge is you, as a manager, you're a bridge to the main part of the organization. But as a pre-sales individual, you also serve as a bridge to your core values as an organization as well, right? You're representing your company to these customers. So it never pays to really try and put some of your problems back on them, right? Why would you tell a customer, it's going to take a couple of days to get you an answer because I've got to go to the US. I've got to ask Bob, who doesn't work in my time zone, and I've got an extremely bad turnaround on getting that data. You have to internalize those kind of issues and make up for them. You have to be more proactive, more thoughtful about what does this customer need in this situation, and work towards being as efficient and quick as possible. And that actually might make you more effective because you've thought of things that other people might not. So that would be one angle, and I think everyone has that kind of problem. I'm sure you had that when you were working in the US for a European organization. You always had the issue of, I've got to go and ask someone about this.
Yeah. Well, you're right, but I love what you just said, right? Which is, look, our problems are just that, our problems, and they need not be the customer's problems. They need not be something the customer should worry about, right? And it's really on us. I think you used the word proactive. It's really on us to be proactive, to make the buyer's experience as smooth and clean as possible, and to anticipate challenges along the way. To that end, are there specific things that you and your team do to maybe anticipate some of those challenges or try to get ahead of the ball a little bit in that regard?
For sure. So, we do things like we make sure we've got our own support organization locally, right? So one of our strongest capabilities in our team in Europe is what we call a technical sales engineering team, who are our internal experts on the products. They help us build better systems for customers, but they help us think about our customer challenges
Mm.
and prepare data sets, prepare demo stories, and work with the customers on those. So we do have that function in the pre-sales team itself to make sure that we're more effective, and
In
that's one
Europe.
way. Yeah, yeah, a sizable team.
Yeah.
So we make sure that we use that team, and from my point of view as a selfish leader, right, I want to make sure that those people, have a future in pre-sales, right? So they are going to develop, they're learning more, and they turn into some of the strongest individual contributors we have as a team as well. So
Yeah.
it is a great function for us as a company and as a team, but it means that we've always got that really strong domain knowledge on the technology. And maybe to bridge to one of the other team problems that you get from running in Europe is that you have so many different languages, locations, and areas to support. So
Yeah.
if you can have that strong technology function, it means that you've got a team of specialists that you can take to any opportunity. But then you need, say, a more customer-facing role that focuses on being in the right language, in the right locations, and to understand the needs of your customers by industry and by location better.
Yeah. I have a question about that technology sales engineering team, but I'm going to hold that for a minute because I just want you mentioned the language in the different countries. You were just mentioning a moment ago with all the different people you're bringing in from different places. Are there specific challenges from a language perspective and or from a culture perspective? I'm asked, particularly when I'm doing workshops for a multinational organization, people will often ask me, Chris, how do some of the things that you talk about differ culture by culture? Again, I'm not the most ideal person to address all cultures. What are some of the cultural maybe differences or challenges that you face sort of, country to country? And are there specific things that you instruct or guide your team to do?
Well, language obviously is the most important of those cultural issues. And it even goes beyond just being a pure native language speaker of the right language, because you get regional dialects, you get differences, right? So if I put my Glaswegian in front of someone who's not a native English speaker, they might actually struggle to connect. And so, you look around Europe and you get those kinds of issues too. But the cultural effect is also interesting, right? So in our product areas, right, maybe the spend on labor is an interesting area to think about. So how much do you spend on people doing work to further the cause of your IT? And so the labor rules in Europe are very different. And in actually every country in Europe can be significantly different. And the population's view on doing things about labor can be very different, right? So
Yeah.
your view on whether you're quickly changing the size of teams, or if you're investing more or you're de-investing, all of those things become culturally important, not just language important, right?
Yeah.
So it might be higher up on your list of key motivations for your buyers, or it might be lower down. They might actually react negatively if you bring in certain suggestions to them based on the local culture. But I'd also say you've got different attitudes in each country to buying different technologies.
Yeah.
Some vendors that are big in one country might be almost non-existent in another country.
Yeah.
So you need to understand and know, say, the technical integrations, the prime use cases that you might want to take to each country or to each market, and then divides up your resources in a new way, right? So I think that final point is a really interesting one too, particularly if you're working at a startup or a small organization. You really need to think about where are you putting your people, and if the answer is probably very different if you have a team of 3 than if you had a team of 10 to a team of 100, right?
Yeah.
Your choices in where your people need to be and what their skills that you're hiring for could be very different.
Yeah. I got to say, Greg, that was so helpful for me. I mean, just hearing your perspective that, look, depending on the business culture of the given country that you're operating in, might change their business drivers or how they prioritize business drivers or how they prioritize quote use cases, as sometimes we like to say, and that really changes the way you position your solution. So that's a very tangible takeaway for me. That
Yeah.
resonates a great deal.
But I'd say it probably works in internationally completely, right? Because wherever you're working, there are going to be some language issues or some cultural issues, and you need to think about them.
Yeah, for sure. I told you I had a question about the technical sales engineering team. By the way, folks, for any of you who've just joined, I'm speaking with Greg Holmes. He's the area vice president of pre-sales at Apptio in Europe. We're talking about European and international pre-sales. We're also going to talk about onboarding. Before we get there, I told you I wanted to ask about the technical sales engineering team. My guess is that there might be some folks listening, or might be someone who catches the recording who finds themselves thinking, that sounds great, Greg. I would love to have a team dedicated to building demo stories and demo flows and the data sets that I need, but I haven't been able to justify that investment. My guess is at one point you probably got to a point where you were probably doing that, or your team was doing that on their own, and then the scale just wasn't there and you had to invest. At what point did you make that investment? And what advice would you give for maybe an SE leader that doesn't have that but needs to make that business case?
Yeah, so I didn't make the initial investment in Apptio in that function, but I have certainly helped push that along. And I can give you some of the ideas about why we did it as an organization. But also in a previous role, right, we saw a need to have someone focused on our demo environments, our base images that we'd use for different customer data, and how we hosted all of those kinds of things. And I think the easy starting point is, as soon as you've got problems because people are copying data and moving it around, or you've got bad version control on your demo systems, you will notice that there's a drop off in win rate. You will be able to point to particular opportunities or deals that took far too long to convince your customers, or maybe you never convinced your customers, and you can point your number one reason down to bad data, bad demos, technology issues. As soon as you've got that problem, you should try and work towards establishing how big is that problem and what are your potential ways of solving it. For me, a number one way of solving it is putting part of your headcount towards that. And if you've got a headcount of even 4 or 5, it could be that soon that one person will make the other people in that team much more effective by taking this problem away for them. And whether that's a full-time role or just part of what that person's role is, that then serves as part of justification for doing this. But I think as it grows, you then look at how much impact is this team having. So you then have metrics you can measure. So how much do those people work on individual POVs? How much do they work on demos? How many hours does it take to build a good demo environment, or all those things? You could justify it on a cost basis. But I think it's even more exciting if you can notice how it impacts your win rate, right? If you can see the win rate go up, you might be able to see that new starters on your pre-sales team are quicker at getting to being effective and adding value. You'll be able to identify that as a value add of this team as well. And then you just need to go through a regular kind of sizing kind of discussion. How much of this role do you need, and what's the marginal impact of adding another person?
Did you have a hard time finding someone on your team who wanted to take on that role? Because it's a very different. I know for me personally, for example, probably not surprising to anybody, I like to be in front of the customer. I didn't want to be the person behind the scenes working on demo flow, demo data, demo instance. It's just a different set of skills. So did you have some people who just were a logical fit for that, or did you have to find people specific for that?
We originally brought people in for that role, and I see it as a strong part of the pre-sales career path, right? These people, most of them actually, as you say, want to get more in front of customers as they get a taste for it and do it more and more. And as they progress in this role, they start doing demos, right? They start maybe taking one portion of a big demo with their teammates helping them along. But sooner or later, they demonstrate enough expertise. You give them certain opportunities or more tasks that they can work on that are really customer facing and impactful. And they quickly progress. You'll know how quickly they are ready to step up into that role. So I think that's not the challenge. I think the challenge is, how do you find people that are ready for this role, right? And so I feel a lot of the time this is an entry-level role into pre-sales, but you're often looking for people who are effectively doing other roles at this time, right? That shows that there's, a pathway for them to be in pre-sales. And some companies struggle to find people to put straight into a customer-facing pre-sales role, right? That can be a big step up, particularly for people coming from outside of a pre-sales role today. And one of the big challenges of pre-sales is there's maybe not enough people to go for all of the roles that people want to hire for. So if you find another way to bring them in, that's pretty effective.
That's such a good segue into the second part of our conversation today, which is onboarding. And to summarize the last point, what you've done is with this technical sales engineering team, I think I'm saying that right, not only is it an incredibly valuable team for the sales engineers that are out in front of the customers, but it's also a great place for new people entering the field to sort of begin to get their feet wet a little bit and get a taste for what does it mean to be in pre-sales. So let's talk a little bit about onboarding. You mentioned the shortage, if I can paraphrase, that there's a massive shortage in talent in the industry. People are becoming harder and harder to find, which means a lot of new people are entering the profession. What are some of the things that you have done? We've talked about the tech sales engineering team, but what are some of the other things that you're doing to help onboard people quickly and get them up to speed quickly?
Yeah. So assuming you've already found the right people for a role that you have, one of the big things on onboarding is maybe helping them narrow their focus for the beginning period so that they've got more achievable targets. If you've got a multiple product portfolio that you're selling, or multiple different domain areas or industries that you support, I feel like for a new role, the more you give them a focus, they can achieve that quicker, right? So if you're trying to get them to learn 3 products and demo all 3, if you focus on one and get them to demo that to a certain ability, that immediately narrows the focus and shortens the depth until you're happy to put them out there and start adding value. I think once people are adding value, that they know how to learn themselves. People that you're hiring for pre-sales are usually, really good learners. I think they just need to get those early victories so that they see the pathway to what they really want to be doing for your organization.
That is such good advice. Narrowing the focus. I've seen a lot of people struggle on both sides of the equation, leaders and individual contributors, because the focus isn't narrow enough. And that's a really, really good takeaway. What are you typically looking for yourself when you're trying to fill a position? I sort of think of the role in 3 areas, and I'm curious to see if you have a similar model or something very different. But I think of sort of the technical expertise, the people skills, the interpersonal skills, and then the sales acumen, as I like to call it. And I think ideally we'd like to find people with all 3. And like I said, I'm curious to see if you have a 4th and a 5th. But what do you look for, and how do you prioritize what it is you're looking for?
Yeah, I think you definitely want people who realize this is a sales related role, right? But it depends where they're coming from. Sometimes if they're coming from, a more, customer success or delivery kind of role, that might be the last thing they want to hear as they're getting in. So you need to make sure that they realize that what they do today isn't that far from pre-sales. that there are transferable skills, that their knowledge is valued. But if you look at the three areas you suggested, right, if you can come up with some kind of a scorecard for a candidate and say, well, they're super strong in this area. If you look at each of those areas, you've got to decide, are they going to be able to learn the next area, or is that going to be a stumbling block for them?
Yeah.
So I think as soon as you work out this person has what it takes to learn those three areas, and maybe there's easy ways to test some of that, right? Maybe not all of it. But if you have a strong belief that they can grow in those other areas, I would always go for the people who can grow into those roles, as long as you've got the time for them to do so.
Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, are there specific things that you're looking for as indicators that they can grow into those roles?
Yeah. So I think we go back to your three categories, right? The technical category I see more as are they going to be able to cope with the challenges technology-wise your product has?
Yeah.
You might not need everything in order to be successful as a pre-sales person, right? I feel that pretty strongly, right? Sometimes you only need the beginning. You might need some people in your team who have all of that, right? But you don't need everyone in your team to be, that might not be the key strength. The key strength might be the customer communication aspect, right? Understanding requirements, listening to the customer, being patient, understanding the connection, and then responding to that. And I guess part of the strength of that TSE function, again, is if you are hiring people more for the business strength and the communication strength, you can then leverage your technical experts as well, as part of that support team. But then I would say that's the most key skill for me. And then the sales acumen, also very important, right? You want people who can apply leverage, understand whether you have shown enough to the customer. How can you help the customer move forward, rather than just getting stuck in having to show more and more day on day and expanding your scope. So I think that sales acumen is pretty important, and the ability to be a co-pilot with your sales reps, right? Go into deals with them and be seen as a valued resource.
Yeah.
So they need that. And I don't know how readily you can teach that aspect. I think there are some natural aspects to being sales savvy, if you like.
Yeah. Well, particularly the term that came to mind as you were speaking is EQ, emotional intelligence. I think a certain amount of emotional intelligence is foundational for this role. And you're right. I mean, look, there are very specific ways that we can teach sales skills, like asking questions in a certain way, right? And responding to questions in a certain way, right? But there's a certain emotional intelligence, I think, required.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of that training falls more into the category of, here are some ways that you're leaking value, right? You're by going through these kinds of questions, or telling them these things, you're actually giving up on some of the advantages you had already to that point, right? Or maybe not asking questions, or not following up quickly enough with customers. You're leaking value. But I think they need to get, what is your sales strategy? How are you trying to win this deal, and working with the customer? I'd say also, though, where you don't confuse the being sales savvy with being necessarily 100% on board with getting into sales straight away either, right? Some people will be skeptical about taking on a sales job, right? They've got to deal with commission. They've got to deal with they're not getting paid by the hour for their hours as a contractor or a consultant anymore. They're getting paid in results, in outcomes.
Yeah. Well, and just the words sales strategy, and just the understanding that there's actually a strategy here, and not just, we don't just show up to have good conversations. I know you've read the book, and you've heard me talk probably countless times. People have heard me say, the first time I heard sales and process used in the same sentence, I had no idea what they were talking about.
Yeah,
literally. Like,
absolutely.
There's a
you don't just turn up.
thing,
Yeah,
right?
you don't just turn up and show the standard demo every time. That's the best demo you can give, right?
Exactly. So I think just you're right. Just there, just understanding that there's actually a strategy to this. There's a methodology. There's right. But I have to tell you, you have equipped me with so many great ideas and takeaways. The other one that you just shared is this idea of quote leaking value.
Mm,
And I want you to double click on that because I'm not sure I've
okay.
heard that put quite that way, but there is some gold in those two words. Can you elaborate on what you mean by leaking value?
Well, yeah, sure. I used to do a fair bit of online poker and face to face and stuff like that. And as a game, it's really interesting for me in the point of view that you can. It again has strategies and things like that. There are different ways to play, but in any strategy, there are things that help you and there are things that hurt you, and you can measure it, right? So in sales, it's similar, right? You've got, say, an expected value from working with a particular customer. And if you do the right things, you've got a fair chance of winning that. Like, depends on your product, your company, or the solution area, and all of that. But say you had a 50% chance of winning a deal. And if we identify that because Chris, you go in and you introduce yourself as a technician rather than as someone who's there as a business consultant, we work out that the on average customers like you 10% less. Then we could just determine then and there that that is a 10% leak on the value that you're getting out of the deals you work on. And just by fixing that one thing up, and generally doing it better, right? Introducing yourself as a business value consultant for them, customers might react to you better. You get that result, you get extra value. So you'll win, just your win rate goes up, and that is the value. But you could also say you're losing value because the deals you get are smaller because you weren't ambitious enough, right? You weren't going for the full scope of their environment. You went for a smaller scope, and that restricted the amount of value that you could sell the product for.
Yeah. Man, I really I'm going to spend some more time thinking about that. I really love again the mental image, and in fact, I come back to the conversation on the technical sales engineer team that you built, and I asked you at what point did you or did the team recognize the need for that, and you said, well, the moment that we were quote leaking value
Mm-hmm.
because of the data, because of the demo environment, because the tools we had to use, the collateral we had to use wasn't up to par. And as a
Yeah,
result, we were quote leaking value, right? So
yeah,
I
and
really love that image.
yeah, you could probably take any sport you like as well and build up a leaking value kind of conversation around it, right? If it's baseball, I mean, if you're hitting at the wrong balls, I imagine that lowers your chance of getting, to score and get to base, right? Or if you're playing football and you're always kicking long range shots from 50 yards out, then that's probably a value leak because you might be better off trying to move up the field more.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
speaking of the challenges, of being a European pre-sales, when you say football, you mean soccer, right?
Indeed, yeah, but it probably applies to most football sports. But yeah, I'd
Indeed.
say getting back to the European US kind of thing, right? You can't just import the stories that your colleagues from the US give you because they're full of sports analogies, and you need to build your own stories up that will resonate with your customers.
Incredibly well. In fact, I have to pat myself on the back a little bit because, in fact, you may have even read an article I wrote on the Presales Collective called "A Winning Demo is a Team Victory," and I created a reference to a pitcher in baseball throwing a no hitter when I was running some workshops for Europe, and I did some research on cricket, and I said,
Hmm.
when we got to the winning demos team victory, I referenced a hat trick in cricket. So
Oh, that's good.
and I think I understand what it is, at least enough to use the word. So
Oh yeah, hat trick's a match-changing event, right? It's you know 3 wickets in a row, so you're getting a third of the opposition completely out of the game.
yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
that's fantastic. turning our attention back to onboarding just one more minute. Incidentally, folks, and Greg, I had this problem with my streaming platform about a month ago where it wasn't connecting with LinkedIn, and people were sending messages, but I wasn't seeing them. So I don't know if we have people who have been, folks, if any of you have sent messages and we haven't seen them, please accept my apology. If we haven't had any messages, I guess nobody felt like saying hello. In any event, if anybody does care to say hello, I welcome you to do so. And if we don't see them, then maybe there's a connection problem. I do want to get back to the onboarding just one more time. When I asked you, sort of what are some of the things that you do, the first place you went was narrow the focus, which I thought was such a good idea. Anything else in particular that not only that you focus on, but anything that you have found to be particularly effective helping new hires get up to speed quickly?
Yeah, so one that I did hear through Presales Collective, and Clodagh Moriarty, I believe, in Ireland, first gave me this piece of advice, but making sure that there are regular touch points for new starters to deliver something of value, right? So delivering their first demo in their first week. It might seem like a huge task for some products out there, but at the same time, a demo shouldn't be everything, right? Yeah. Their first demo could be a 10-minute kind of 3 bullet point kind of presentation on here's an important aspect of the solution and how it helps customers. Take a customer problem, challenge, and give a quick way to demonstrate that capability back. It doesn't have to be War and Peace.
Yeah.
So giving those bite-sized little snippets that people can go and achieve straight away. And you never know, that might be the topic of your next webinar for your customer base, right? So you can instantly bring in someone who's fresh and excited about your solution area, has a good presentation around it, and it might be immediately useful.
I so love that advice. And again, the mental image that comes, to mind for me is, at some point you just got to jump into the game, right? I mean, you got to jump into the pool and take a sweat. Like you're not, we can sit around and talk about what it takes to, quote, ride a bike, for example, but until you get on the bike and actually try to ride, you're not going to find out, where the problems are. So
yeah, absolutely. And then we use Gong, which is a great tool for recording sales pitch sessions and sales meetings, which won't be as useful when every meeting is on face-to-face again. Yeah. But I doubt that's ever going to happen. So it still will remain useful, but it means that you can review any meeting that people have been to recently. So you can go in and it can give you indications of what's been talked about. You could go and search for the right kind of product or the right industry or the right kind of customer challenge and really hone into, meetings that actually make a difference to you on your development.
So well said. Incidentally, we did get a hello from Lucia. So it's good to know, Lucia. Thank you for saying hello. We also had just a hello from another, quote, LinkedIn user. So whoever it is that said hello, it is good to know that we've got at least a few folks with us live. Greg, one more question, and then we're going to finish with a bit of a lightning round. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about the differences between European being in pre-sales in Europe, and working more in an international type of role. I can't help but ask you: are there for those of you, yourself, your team who work with work with the American teams? It's really a two-part question. As when you look at your American pre-sales counterparts, is there anything about what we do, the way we operate, that you all admire in particular?
Well, for me, I certainly love the fact that in the US, you can bring in an absolute expert halfway across the continent for the right situation and drop them in. And it can make a lot of sense to do so, right? The scaling of teams means that you can focus, you don't have to focus on language, you can focus on industry, you can focus on individual products and things like that. So your ability to specialize and think of those situations so much better is amazing. And, I feel like my US counterparts do lift a heavy load when it comes to providing a lot of reusable components and demos and things like that.
Yeah.
So I certainly admire that ability and their capability to do so. Plus, I think having a large nation like that where you're able to use similar stories and have resonating customers across the whole continent is amazing too, right?
Yeah.
I have to go to some meetings and you're struggling because you're thinking of, all right, I could use this customer, but they're not French, right? They won't sound right to this customer. That still won't resonate in the same way that a more local customer would.
For sure.
So those are two things I can immediately think of that I really admire.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm inclined to ask in reverse. By the way, before I do, we had another person, and again, unfortunately, we don't see the name, but he or she said just joined a new company and looking forward to the first 10-minute intro. Well, to that individual, I'm going to wish you the best of luck in your first 10-minute demo. Greg, the flip side of that question, as you observe some of what is done in the Americas from a pre-sales perspective, do you ever find yourself thinking that won't work in Europe, or that won't work in some of the business cultures that we operate?
Yeah, I think it's leaving room in your setup, in your demos or in your stories for it to be localized. So making sure that you don't only pick data, data sets, data names, locations, depending what you're selling, right? But make sure that your story could be internationalized and could be made global, or else you're going to have to build another 2 or 3 demo systems to be able to go and work everywhere. So I think thinking truly internationally, I think there's ways to do it, right? Like if you can imagine a hierarchy of lists or things like that in your tool, you could easily make one branch US focused, and then you could develop other branches that could tell a similar but nuanced story for different regions or locations. And that'd be one way to do it.
Such good advice. Such good advice. I am glad I asked that. Again, it's just such a good reminder, particularly for those of us who might be responsible for creating reusable demo assets, reusable pre-sales assets for a global organization. We've got to think internationally and outside of our borders. Incidentally, that was Carlos Villanueva. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Carlos, good luck on your new venture. Greg, as always, you've been so gracious with your time. If you can believe it, we've been at this for almost 50 minutes. Before we move into our lightning round, any final thoughts from you on either of those two topics, the international conversation and or the onboarding conversation?
Well, I actually want to come back to the technical team and roles in that team, because I don't think they're only feeder roles into other pre-sales positions. I think there is actually strong roles within that team as well as growth, right? So if you imagine you've got a huge set of different interconnecting technical products, that demo story could be magnificent, right? If you can get all those things so that they work well together. So thinking about stories where you open up one product and you're talking about an aspect there. If you opened up a completely different product, you still want to be able to tell a consistent story. So if you have an object that hooks in there, you can imagine that the architecture behind such a system is quite complex, and so there's plenty of room to grow in that technical role if that's what your true love is, right? You don't have to go for one of those more customer centric roles. You could stay in that demo centric or that proof of concept centric kind of role and own those challenges, because they're mighty challenges for a team too.
I am so glad you mentioned that. You're 100% right. Some of the best, quote, sales engineers that I've worked with over the years were more the behind the scenes sales engineer, right? They weren't in product, they weren't consulting, they weren't necessarily out on the front line, but they built the demo stories, the demo assets, right? The pre-sales assets that made us look like rock stars out on the front line. And some of them, not only were they some of the most senior folks in the organization, but they had to be, because it required someone with knowledge and understanding of the industry, knowledge and understanding of the product, right? The ability to create those compelling stories and demo and data assets. So that's a really good point. For there might be some people out there that think, well, I think I'd like to get into pre-sales, but I'd like to work more on the demo, more on the assets. There is absolutely a need for that in this industry.
Yeah, those roles are out there and they're pretty amazing. Like if you can imagine, what went into, say, the behind the scenes production for some of the big Apple product launches of the early 2000s, right? Steve Jobs didn't just walk on stage and bring out an iPod and make it work. There
Yeah.
was so much planning behind those kinds of events, and the
Yeah.
people who did those were truly talented.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you did, for those of us who benefit from the people who are behind the scenes making that happen, we need to remember to give them credit where credit is due. So no, that's really well said. So, Greg, if I can indulge you for just a few more minutes, I've got just a few quick questions. Now, you may recall last year I used to sort of do this as quote check in with the doctor. I've graduated to tech sales advice, so the lightning round is focused a little bit more on advice. So, the first question is: as you reflect on your career, is there any piece of advice in particular that you received along the way that really stood out and sort of made a significant impact on you?
I think the best thing ever was just being told to think of this from the other person's perspective all the time, right? You might be an absolute genius, but if you're not presenting things in the way that the other person wants to appreciate them, then you're not communicating.
Mm, that is as good a piece of advice as I think I've heard anybody give. That is so profound. Question number two. And now that we're all out and about, this might actually happen. You walk onto an elevator and somebody gets on the elevator with you. You're going up to the 20th floor, and this individual turns to you. By the way, the first few times I said this, we have masks on. We may not have masks on now. This person turns to you and says, "Oh my goodness, Greg Holmes, I just saw you on LinkedIn Live. I just got my first role as a sales engineer. Any advice for me on our way up to the 20th floor?"
That's a great question, Chris. So if it's your first role as a sales engineer, I would look at, you understand what you know, right? Your knowledge is valuable, but it's like a big tool chest. Only bring out the things when you need them, right? And don't show people everything that you can do. You're not there to prove yourself. You've already done that by getting the job. So just go in and learn what they want from you.
Again, those are fantastic words. I may have to take little clips of both of those responses and put them on a subsequent post. That was good stuff. Final question for you, Greg. And this you may recall from last year, but I'm going to ask it again. If you could ask me one question, what might that be?
If I could ask you one question, it would be, if you restarted your career as a sales engineer, how would you have changed it?
Wow, that's a good question. I would probably do what you just said, which is, in fact, I might do the two things that you just said, because I'm pretty sure I made both of those mistakes when I first got into this role. I think I was too worried about being the expert, too worried about demonstrating how smart I was, too worried about showing everything in the toolbox. And I didn't approach it from the buyers or the prospects or the customer's point of view. And it took me, took me a good 3 to 6 months to figure out that every engagement was not just, and by the way, I came from a consulting background, and as a consultant, this is what we do in many cases.
Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah.
are hired to be the expert, right?
Yeah,
When
you've got
you're
to show
hired,
you're an expert, that there's points to keep you in the room, right?
exactly. And I think I would have become a student of sales right out of the gate. But and anybody who's read the book knows that I didn't think of myself as, when I first took this role, I didn't think of myself as being in sales. I thought of myself, I
Definitely.
still thought of myself as the technology professional who just happened to be the person giving the demonstration as the salesperson's sidekick. So that's what I would have followed the very advice I think that you just shared.
But
So
I would have done the same, Chris. I wish I knew half that stuff at the beginning. And, I still look at meetings these days and see things that, I offered that sort of advice to them. They didn't ask for that. They didn't even seem that interested when I was giving it to them, but I insisted on giving it to them, right?
well, and look, sales engineer, we tend to come by that honestly, right? I sincerely think that we're eager to please. I sincerely think that we're natural problem solvers. And we sort of just assume that if I have an answer to a question, or I have an insight, uh, we just sort of assume that people want to hear what we have to say. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
So, and it brings us back to this idea of emotional intelligence that we talked about earlier. Greg, thank you so much for spending time. You've given this audience an hour of your time. Any words in closing before we part ways?
I think just trying to understand the value you're providing customers, and, remembering that, right? Remembering what is important to them. And, if you can be more prepared for your sessions, right? Just take in a list of things that they might ask you for, so that you're as prepared as possible.
That is fantastic, Greg. Thank you so much. And folks, for any of you who may have hung around the entire time, thank you for listening in. If you've listened to the recording, I've been reminded by a few of my colleagues that I don't mention often enough some of the ways in which you can find us. If you like these and you want to follow along with these LinkedIn Live sessions, just follow the hashtag Tech Sales Advice. If you're new to the profession and you're looking for some training or some help, there's some online training available at demodoctor.com. And of course, come check us out at techsalesadvisors.com. Greg, thank you again so much for your time. Hang around for just a minute. I'm going to give you your parting gift. Otherwise, folks, thanks so much for tuning in. We will talk to you in a week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Greg. Cheers.